I am Anne Choquette. I am the CEO of TheLi.st. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for Launch with TheLi.st. This is a series of book launches that we do for members of TheLi.st. And I'm sitting in our HQ surrounded by books that listers have written. And so I'm so grateful for you all to be here today to help celebrate the book birthday of Ali Yarrow for birth control. Oh, maybe birthday. Yeah. Is it okay? We can call it a book birthday. Is that
birth week?
Is that easier to birth this book than to give birth to an actual child, maybe? I'm thrilled for Ali to be here. This is her second book. The first is 90s Bitch, which I had the privilege of being in conversation with her about when that launched. And we have Kimberly Seals Allers here today. Kimberly is the founder and CEO of the Earth app. It's like birth, but you drop the B for bias, which is really like the best tagline.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
And Siri would like to be a part of the conversation. Well, on my side. Well, I don't know. Oh, when I said Kimberly Allers, it said got Siri. Well, that's embarrassing. But I thank you all for being here today. Keep your mics on mute, keep your cameras on. We'd love to see you. Ask questions in the chat. I'm going to put a link to buy the book because we want to see this book hit all sorts of bestseller lists. And I am going to turn it over to Kimberly and Ali.
Hello, hello. It's so exciting to be here and to be in conversation with Ali around this important topic and around this important book. So if you haven't heard, the state of birth in America is in a lot of trouble. And we can look at the statistics, we can look at the current threads and where we know there are policy gaps. But I think it's important that we understand the backstory, right? The history, how we got here, and what power we have as women and birthing people to shift the trajectory, right? If any. And so I'm excited to be in conversation with Ali today. I am also the author of The Big Letdown, How Medicine, Big Business, and Feminism Undermine Breastfeeding. And I think it's important that we continue to have more books that look into the cultural, the social landscape of birth and breastfeeding, because I think it's an area of our lives where it gets overly simplified and there's a lot of blame and guilt and emotions, but without understanding the context. So I'm excited to be able to talk to Ali today. So how does it feel? Tell us a little bit from, as an author, how does it feel for your book release week?
It's been great. I want to thank Anne and thank TheLi.st for having me, and thank you, Kimberly. I've followed you and your work for a long time, and it's just been so. I love The Big Letdown. I have a chapter in the book about breastfeeding, and The Big Letdown was just a beacon for me, such good information and good resources, and just a way of looking at that topic and seeing the ways in which you already spoke to this. We internalize blame for structural problems, and breastfeeding is absolutely a huge example of that, which I try to kind of get to the bottom of in my chapter. But it's been a real eye-opening experience to work on the book and write the book as I was sort of giving birth to children myself and experiencing all of this. My training, as you know, is as a journalist, and so reporting this deeply was incredibly important to me. And it was sort of where I began, because I didn't even necessarily initially trust my own instincts that birth was an area that was also touched by structural misogyny and white supremacy. You know, it's like, oh, everything else is, but birth is somehow sacred. Entering it for the first time, that was an opinion I had. But it's been really fabulous to talk to people about this book. Inevitably, people want to share their birth stories, and I have no boundaries around this stuff. So I just share mine and I ask for others to share theirs. And it's really this invitation to share our stories. I mean, that's what I'm living for right now, because that is data and that is evidence, and that's what we need.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's dig into it. I mean, I think as a level set, to your point, many people look at things that, birthing people have been doing for years and like, oh, it's just going to happen. I think one of the quotes in the book, I thought it would be like peeing, it's like we're just told these things to happen. But
Breastfeeding, yeah.
let's just have a level set. Like, how did we get here in terms of where, particularly women in America and birthing folks in America find themselves on the state of birth overall? I mean, by any measure, in terms of maternal health, maternal mortality, we are always at the bottom of the list. We are always being compared to, less developed countries in terms of our maternal mortality rate nationwide. So, give us a little perspective. How did we get here?
There's a short history that I can share that I think really encompasses everything that you're asking. And that's when America was founded, the way birth happened here in our country was that it was a tradition that women undertook together. So it was communal. It was attended by midwives. Midwives in early America were Indigenous and Black women. The way that they sort of shared their expertise was through apprenticeship. They taught other people to do this work. And people knew what birth was and what it looked like, physiologic birth, because we did it together. Today, for most of us, the first birth we witness is our own. And what happened, how that shifted was, there were white men in America who went to Europe to medical school to become doctors, to do this specific kind of training that existed there. They came back to America to set up their practices, and they realized that while people were sick and ill and needed care, birth was happening everywhere. And if they wanted to establish themselves in their profession and they wanted to be experts, they needed to attend birth. And so they sought out midwives to teach them how to attend birth. And the vision that the female body, the female pelvis needed care, needed support, that was sort of baked in to this idea for white men who were doctors. I find it so fascinating that people who never have and never will give birth sort of began to overtake birth and attend birth. And they initially collaborated with midwives, but eventually they sort of pushed them out, took women, took birth, said, we now have, we have training, we have tools, we have drugs, we have procedures. And, at the turn of the century, we have hospitals, and all of these things are safer and they all cost more money. But if you want to have a better birth experience, you have to come do it here with us. And that was sort of the way that birth evolved to sort of be attended by men who, again, never will give birth, and to occur in a place where, although they said it was safer, studies at the time found it was in fact not safer. It was a lot less safe because of puerperal fever. We didn't understand that hand washing prevented the spread of bacteria, and people were dying in the hospitals, but they were doing well at home. And the data that we have about early birth in America, is that home birth was incredibly safe and outcomes were really good. But it was a narrative shift that also happened with the move of birth from home to hospital.
Yeah. And it's really fascinating to see how people who don't have uteruses became the dominant thinkers. And I think there was a kind of concurrent theme around better living through science, and that the things that we were doing were actually not advanced. And if you wanted to be advanced, and then of course included with that was the demonization of things that Black and brown folks were doing in terms of midwifery or other kind of childbirth practices, child rearing practices. So much about what people think about pediatric care is rooted in, kind of demonizing the cultures of Black and brown folks and putting that as wrong as the way around parenting. So it's a very fascinating, also enraging type of a history. I want to talk a little bit about chapter 3, because I think this is very much a thread, which is called fear of pain. Because I think this fear of pain, even on the side of those of us, women and birthing people, has been a tool, one of those tools that you're mentioning. So we'd love for you to share a little bit more about some of the thoughts that you talk about, but what role has the fear of pain played in all of this?
Thank you for that question. I love talking about this. As I was working on the book, I tried really hard to, even though it was difficult for me personally, sometimes move toward topics or areas that felt uncomfortable and that felt like the kinds of things that I couldn't talk to my friends about, maybe I couldn't talk to my family about. And that was one of them, sort of that fear. And it took me a while, I think, to unpack in myself that I had that fear going into birth for the first time. I kind of expected becoming pregnant for the first time and seeking care that people were going to tell me what to expect. And what I got instead of what to expect, I got, like, these are the strollers that you need and the tests you need to take. And like, here's what you put in your hospital bag. It was all of this sort of logistics and, consumption and all of this stuff. And I kept wondering, like, when is someone going to tell me, like, what does a contraction feel like in my body? What is going to happen in my body when my body goes into labor? That's what I need to know. Right. And I knew that I wanted
to focus on that commercial and the things you have to buy, but not too much information on how you expect to be. That's why I was looking. I'm just like, hey, it's like you can buy something for everything, because again, this is our commercialized society, which also commercialized birth. But yeah, I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, of course. I'm glad you jumped in with that. I mean, and to your point about fear, I think there's a way in which we go toward that as people giving birth because we are afraid. It's a lot easier to make a spreadsheet of all the strollers that you want to consider than it is to really reckon with, like, what is this going to feel like? Like, how am I going to do this? This is something I can only imagine. I've never seen it happen before. No one's talking to me about it. Not my care providers, not necessarily the women or people in my family who've done this before. And I absolutely did that. I mean, I know that I did. Yeah, so that's real. But I mean, I think, the fear of pain, physiologic birth is absolutely something that the research tells us the majority of people can do. They just need to be accommodated with the right conditions. And that is absolutely not happening in the hospital environment, which is a place where some 99% of birth in our country occurs. The birthing body, we know from evidence and anecdote, needs things like darkness, quiet, the feeling of safety, these kind of simple things. But the hospital is the environment is the antithesis of all of that. It's lights and it's strangers and it's all kinds of fear. And so the body literally just the body shuts down in labor with all of that assault and all of that sensory experience. And and by the way, the research tells us that causes pain. That actually causes pain in the body.
And, as two journalists, I love what is also what's interesting to me is thinking about the ways that really media and television, right? So we think, to your point, like, because we don't see birth, we're being held captive to the images that we see. And those on television was somebody's screaming, someone's running for a cab and a water breaks. And then everybody starts yelling. And I'm like, does it have to be this way? And so really thinking about, how powerful it was when we stopped seeing it for ourselves, then the stories that we were being told about it was what we accepted as real, right? Because those were the images that we had. We had no counterbalancing. I didn't go to be in a room when my, cousins, auntie, nieces gave birth, as would have happened before. And so these realities were real versus what could be. And I think, understanding the way the story of birth has been told, and I often say sold to us, has been an important piece of that, and where the media has played a part in all of that, right? And on the breastfeeding side, you think of nipple squirting milk as being comedic, and it's like, well, that's not the way breastfeeding is supposed to work, actually. So there's been a way that we've been kind of marketed what birth should look like, and we haven't had anything to counter that, and it's very dangerous, and pain has been a big part of that.
Yeah, it's a scary thing, the feeling of being in pain. But it's interesting, I don't really describe my births as feeling painful. I mean, I'm sure that they were in a sense, but I describe them as feeling like intense effort, but not pain. Because I prepared, I took a lot of, I took an 8-week birthing class in the Bradley method, which is, it was called husband coach childbirth, and they've updated their language to reflect the fact that all partners in birth are not husbands. But that was so useful because our teacher taught us to practice relaxing our body, to practice that release, and sort of being able to understand what a contraction was, what the uterus was doing during a contraction, and how I could allow and open my body to support that movement through breath, through relaxing. All of that was such empowering information. And I was incredibly privileged to be able to access that, but everyone should be able to access that. It's simple technology. It isn't costly at all. We should all be able to sort of have that education that we're not getting.
Yeah. And I find that when I speak to mamas who have been under midwifery care, they talk about surges and they have another language. And I just love it. I just love it. I'm like, I love that language. Like, surges and understanding what your body is doing, the purpose, they're focusing on the goal, not the moment that they're in. There's a whole bunch of other techniques, but I think the ways that we've been marketed fear has been one of the most detrimental things for women, because in so many other areas we feel fearless. I always tell the people, the pain that people have endured for bikini waxes and Brazilians is nothing. Repeatedly, you pay money
Cosmetic
for
surgery, yes.
right, cosmetic surgery. So the things that pain is acceptable for, tattoos, anybody with tattoos who says something to me, I'm gonna ask you some questions, right? So the things that we've been sold are acceptable forms of temporary pain versus those related to childbirth, lactation, et cetera, always boggles my mind, because there are plenty of people with literal arms of tattoos but talk about the pain of childbirth. I'm like, but did that hurt?
Yeah, so I want to jump in and get to something that I think speaks to both of the questions you asked about pain and also about how did we get here, which is that now that we are here and we do all of these procedures in the hospital, and there's a real path when you enter the hospital in labor, what's going to happen to your body, not because it's the best thing, but because it's efficient and because it supports the managed care model, which is not individual care for birthing people, which is the kind of care that birthing people need, no matter where it occurs, but it's care for many people at once, efficiently and cost effective, is a lot of research studies that sort of back up these technologies about pain management and about what happens to your body when you get into the hospital and what it needs as a laboring person. These studies are very poor. They're not conducted on a broad population of people. They're not, the best standard of evidence, a clinical trial. And they often feature a technology being introduced, not because it's thought that it's going to make labor better, less painful, safer for women and birthing people and for babies, but because it's going to make labor and delivery in a hospital environment quicker and more efficient. And an example of this is Pitocin. Pitocin, the study that we think sort of kicked off Pitocin use in hospitals in the 70s, started administering it not to support people in their pain, but to move people along and move them through the hospital. And it's similar with, with pelvic exams, right? Most hospitals, it's not sort of stated that you're required to have a pelvic exam to be admitted. And yet we know from research and from what people tell us about their experiences that to get in the hospital in labor, you have to have a pelvic exam. You're often consented to this exam, or it's maybe even forced upon you, but there's really very little basis in evidence for doing this exam. We really can't tell how far along in labor you are by, sticking fingers in a vagina. And we've been taught to believe that pelvic exam is necessary. The Pitocin, by the way, with Pitocin, there's very little standard dosing. We don't know what the right dose is. People sort of, the big study that looked at Pitocin across the world and sort of how much was being used and how often, absolutely no standard here. It's sort of at the whim of the doctor. You can be given too much, you can be given too little, whatever that means. There are other pain management techniques that can be used that are supported in evidence, like massage and water and peanut balls and, allowing people to eat and drink during labor, which hospitals, many have policies preventing that from occurring. But all of this just says to me, and electronic fetal monitoring, oh my gosh, that's another one, right? Almost everybody, you walk into the hospital, they want to strap you onto that monitor so that they can watch your labor from somewhere else. And yes, I understand, hospitals are short-staffed. People that get into medicine are heroes and they want to do good, but that technology has no firm footing in evidence. And in fact, it's more likely to cause intervention like C-section and other interventions that not only are often done unnecessarily, but that women and birthing people say that they do not want and they do not need them.
Right. And, I think it's so interesting because, what birth really needs is simply time and space. And those are the two things, to your point, that the current system do not allow for, right? And so it is about management. Everyone knows laying on your back prone is the worst position to advance birth, but it is the most convenient and easier for efficiency and management. So this is why we end up that way, even though walking could be helpful, water. I know you talked about a shower, like all of these things, which we know helps, are just not able to be managed. Telling people they can't eat, which is just because they don't want the cleanup problem. I mean, all of these things which have nothing to do with what's best and optimal for the birthing person. And, that's a little scary. That's a little scary. I'm going to come back to what I want to ask you about that, but I want to, remind folks that if you have some questions, please put them in the chat. We'll get to questions in a few minutes. And I wanted to talk to you about how you start off chapter 5, because chapter 5 begins with an intergenerational conversation. And I think looking at perceptions of birth through the generations is fascinating. On my podcast, I interviewed my mom to hear my birth story, and similar to what your grandmother said, my mother went to sleep and woke up and was a mom, and just no idea. I think she said she saw me 2 days later, which kind of hurt my feelings. But when we look at this intergenerational approach to birth, what did you find most striking about these conversations? And then what do you think is happening with the next generation of mothers?
I love that question. It has to do with the storytelling, right? I mean, we don't often know what our own birth stories are. When I did the survey work that I did for this book, I surveyed about 1,300 people and women and birthing people about their experiences with birth. And a very large percentage are never asked to share their birth story, would share their birth story. People want to share their birth stories, particularly people who have had experiences that they would describe as traumatic or even just didn't quite meet their expectations. They will share those stories, according to my data, if it will help other people, specifically because they want to help other people. And I think, these birth experiences, we're allowed to believe, we're encouraged to believe, in fact, that when things don't go to plan, it's our fault. Emergency C-section because failure to progress, that language, something was wrong with your body was taking too long. And so we internalize this message that I did something wrong, this was my fault. And so then it's very easy to say, okay, I'm putting that away, I don't want to talk about that. And I get that, I 100% get that. There were elements of my hospital births that I would describe as coercive, being, sort of, I don't know how I ended up on my back at one point, I don't remember choosing that position. I don't know how I ended up there, but I don't know that we've, until recently, kind of had the language around trauma and the awareness to kind of share these experiences intergenerationally. It was really striking for me because I had a conversation with women in my family about episiotomy. And there was a conversation about, women believing that episiotomy, doctors telling them, episiotomy is better and safer because we cut a straight line and you can sew a straight line and that heals better than if you're to tear naturally on your own. And just hearing that, I had believed that for a long time. And then I started to think that sounds awfully patriarchal, doesn't it? I want to look at the evidence here. I want to understand, let's look at the evidence behind episiotomy. And when I did that, it was so clear that, first of all, there's not a lot of great studies about episiotomy. There are a couple of good ones and they're pretty old, but the clinical trials, the sort of definitive ones, basically say that it has almost no use in birth at all. And the researchers even went as far to say that to move toward a kind of birth that is supportive of human rights would be to almost eliminate episiotomy entirely. And this is the case, and also it's the case that hospitals are required to report their numbers on this, because episiotomy is a surgical procedure, and they don't share these numbers with the public. The Leapfrog group, which is a healthcare watchdog, they've done fantastic work around this, and they believe that up to, some hospitals, up to 40% of births, they're cutting episiotomies today. That's today. When we know that this is damaging, that it causes tears, that they're difficult to heal from, that people have all kinds of problems, and that it's a traumatic procedure. And I didn't specifically ask about the procedure in my survey, but the people in my survey who volunteered that they had episiotomies, more than half of them did not consent to that procedure. And so that leads me to believe that many people, and I've heard this anecdotally, I hear this all the time, people had episiotomies and they didn't know that they had episiotomies until they were being stitched up, or they were long after. What's happening? I have stitches. Why do I have stitches? Having to then ask. And that's episiotomy without consent is medical battery. And that's tremendous trauma. But you know what? We have to tell these stories, and we certainly have to tell them intergenerationally to kind of heal this intergenerational trauma and understand better what we can do to advocate for ourselves. And I don't want to say that it's our responsibility to fix this as women and birthing people. It's not. It's on the system. The system needs to change for us. But when we know that this is what's happening in the system, we have to protect ourselves with education.
Yes, so true. And I think, when I look at this, a younger generation of mothers who have so much more access to information, I think on the other side of what I was talking about the media stories, that, social media being a blessing and a curse, most days a curse, but where mothers are sharing more honestly, they're showing their C-section scars and their postpartum stretch marks and the realities of birth. And I don't know about you, but on my feed, I see a lot of vaginas and babies coming out all the time. Like, we are just putting it out there. I'm like, okay, this is what we're doing. So now people do have the ability to see it, right? And to know what's possible, and to see mothers in tubs. And actually, they are not yelling. They are not yelling. It was really,
No.
And the babies aren't yelling. I'm like, this is all very interesting. So I'm hopeful for the next generation of mothers that, their ability to see more than what we could see could actually create a new vision in their minds and in their hearts around what is possible. And then we have to push, to your point, to make sure that the system is in place to make that possible. Because on the other side of it, we don't want people, giving birth alone at home with a YouTube video. That's not a good solution as well. So, we are hopeful to kind of get to the into the middle. So speaking about, solutions, like, I do feel like there's a piece of this that I call women's work, that we have to clamor for, in the same way that we've clamored for a lot of things, from slimming undergarments, to, cosmetic things. Like, we have to fight for this and demand more. What do you think is the part that we need to hold? And then what do you see as a solution that needs to happen on the systems level?
I love that. On the systems level, it's kind of simple. The person giving birth is the expert in her body, and what she says goes. What she and her trusted people that she has brought into the experience with her doula, her partner, whomever, like, their expertise starts there. Mm-hmm. Everyone else is in partnership with that expertise, like that. I mean, and it's so simple, but it's a huge shift. It would be a huge shift to go there
in the medical
right?
community.
A complete shift. So we have to advocate for that. And I think, many of us want all the data and all the studies when we become pregnant. We want all of this at our fingertips, or we want, experts to synthesize it for us and have us make the decision based on someone else's synthesis of all the data. Okay, I'm going to do this. But I think what needs to happen is, whether or not you've read all the studies, whether or not you've read a million books or heard a million birth stories, whatever it is that you want, you should have. And you don't have to, the expertise doesn't have to be found in a study for you to be validated in that choice. Last night at the launch of the book at McNally Jackson, I had a fabulous conversation with Natasha Perlman, who's the executive editor of Glamour magazine. And it was so interesting. She said, if I could do it over again, I would have 2 C-sections. I wouldn't just have one, I would have 2 C-sections. And I said, you know what? I would never have a C-section. I loved my physiologic births. They were some of the hardest work I've ever done, but so fulfilling for me. But I support your decision to have whatever kind of birth you want to have. And I think that's what we need to do. I think we all need to sort of be able to hear others' experiences and say, yes, what's for you is for you. You should have that and be supported by that and validated in that by your care team, whether it's in a birth center, in a hospital, at home, a midwife or an obstetrician, an anesthesiologist, whoever's involved. And I should be able to have for me. And these things, we shouldn't have to sort of be threatened by each other's choices.
I agree. I always tell people, I was just saying this and speaking recently that, as a country, we are obsessed with choice. I always say, have you been through our spaghetti sauce aisle? Like, we're obsessed with variety and choices, and we can't just have one. Like, this is part of the Americanism, right? It is part of our ethos and our tapestry. Like, we want choice. But when it comes to birth, the thing that's literally keeping the population going, most people have very limited choices, right? We know there's a need to increase access to childbirth centers. Right. It's like we are infatuated with the concept, but in this thing that, women and people with uteruses uniquely do, we have pretty much no choice. And that is something that I think we should all be riled up about as people who pride themselves on having options and doing all the things. But it is really scary to me that in this area, we don't have a lot of choice and we don't clamor for that. And I think the shift that needs to happen, is a cultural shift to get doctors to actually listen to women. Girl, that sounds crazy.
It does sound crazy. I know. And it's like, you shouldn't have to be in active, like, choice-making mode while you're in labor. You're vulnerable. You need to focus inward. You need to be doing the work of labor. So that's actually not in the time, really, even for the choices. The choices sort of should already be kind of laid out and made. And it's really, I believe that if people were properly supported, that it wouldn't feel so much like a battle around choice. I think this is one of the most interesting things that I have been thinking about lately, which is that whether or not the trauma research tells us that the style or type of birth you have, whether or not you describe your birth as traumatic, is not really related to that. You could have a home birth with no medication and no pain support, or you could have, an emergency C-section. It's not about that particular style of birth. It's about, did you understand what was happening to your body? Did you feel supported? Were you appraised of what was happening along the way, or were you left in the dark? The Cheryl Beck is the researcher who's done just decades of work on, she's a nurse, but she's also done decades of work on birth trauma, so many amazing studies and so much to learn from her. And what she says that she hears all the time is people who have traumatic childbirth say they feel as though they were raped on the table with everyone watching and no one helping. And that just, every time I just get goosebumps and I feel completely gutted by that. But we know that it's about whether or not you understand what's happening to your body, no matter what kind of birth you have, that determines whether or not you appraise your birth as traumatic. And a central, choice is important, but we need, at a base level, we need informed consent and refusal, which is the law. It means that your healthcare provider, no matter what kind of healthcare you're getting, it could be birth care, it could be anything, they are required by law to present to you your choices, your options. This is the procedure. I'm going to tell you what it is. And they are to equalize your ability to say yes or to say no to that procedure. They're not to manipulate you into doing what they want you to do. And that's not happening. That's just not happening. A lawyer who argues medical battery cases who I interviewed for the book told me, informed consent is the law, but culturally in obstetrics, it's ignored. And that also would be such a huge shift towards your solutions question. If we were to just honor what already is in place in the law of informed consent and refusal, that would radically shift the experience of birth for people.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, one of the things that we find in our Earth App reviews that has been deeply troubling, where we focus really on the experiences of Black and Brown birthing people, is that even when some of them are advocating for themselves, because of the power dynamics, that they feel like they were treated even more harshly because they were educated, right? So yes, they advocated for themselves. They wanted to move around. They knew blah, 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 but you know, as a Black or Brown person, because of the culture of the medical community against birthing bodies, that they felt like they were even treated more harshly for having education. And so, you know, there's always this damned if you do, damned if you don't approach. That's deeply troubling, right? So even if we have the knowledge, is that going to be respected, right? Is it going to be viewed as a problem? And so it's very complicated and shows that we have a deep shift in the medical community that kind of needs to happen. I'm hopeful that more female doctors, more younger doctors, I do find like, you know, some of these folks just may have to die off, you know, with a lot of love and light. And then there's a new generation of physicians, hopefully more women. I think about this as well as politicians. How do we have more mothers making policy decisions, more women more people have given birth to be part of those conversations, which I think could also lead to better laws and hopefully a cultural shift. I wanted to just share briefly, I'm going to check the chat for questions, but would love to talk about the ways that you looked at the racial and economic dynamics of birth control in your research.
Yeah, I was just so disheartened, of course, digging into sort of old medical texts about how birthing bodies were appraised and looked at. And I did find that sort of in old texts that sort of make their way into sort of what's newly taught, there was a historical view that the Black birthing body was more animalistic and didn't need pain medication and could just give birth naturally, whereas the white birthing body required tools and drugs and was too frail to actually give birth. And we can sort of trace the trajectory for how these very old and racist ideas still end up in our care today. And I write about this in the chapter that's called Childbearing Hips. It's sort of a look at the anthropology of birth. In a sense, it's about how this anthropological theory called the obstetric dilemma still sort of shapes how the birthing body is viewed today. And it sort of is foundational. It's about those two kinds of birthing bodies that I described that are sort of this racist idea in the literature. And it sort of came into being through sort of white men who were in anthropology saying that, you know, birthing hips were flawed, the baby's head was too big, and we need to get in there and help, you know, we need to operate, we need forceps, we need all of this technology because the birthing pelvis is flawed. And so that's had over time different ramifications for Black and white birthing bodies. And we see that with the C-section rate even. C-sections are a full third almost of births in this country, not because they are necessary. The vast majority of them are not necessary. It's wonderful that we have this technology for when they are necessary, for the rare instances like conditions like placenta previa, where the placenta is blocking the baby's exit and we need to do a C-section to get the baby out. But most C-sections are for failure to progress, this idea that you're taking too long, and also the use of the electronic fetal monitor, which doesn't have any basis in evidence, but tells people that, also you're taking too long, essentially. And the highest rate of C-sections in our country, the population who has the highest rate of C-sections is Black women. And that is sort of directly descended from this idea that these bodies need an intervention.
Yeah, and I would also add that the most maternal deaths are also happening among Black women, and often the reasons why we are dying are related to complications due to how we have given birth. And so that higher C-section rate is leading to higher rates of hemorrhaging, people having things left inside of them when you have major surgery, all the things that come from that. And so those two are very much connected. And I think people forget that, like, a lot of why we are dying as Black women disproportionately in this country is related to the ways that we are disproportionately giving birth under surgery without, to your point, any real medical need accept the need to move people along and determine whose bodies they want to control.
Thank you for saying that. I know you want to get to the chat, but I'm so glad you said that, because I do feel like that's a major message that's being missed in the media, with all of the coverage of Black maternal mortality being disproportionate to other maternal mortality in this country, is this idea that you just described so beautifully. Like it's 100% related to this. And yet all of the reporting is saying, well, I mean, the maternal mortality rate is high, and it's high among Black women because of obesity and underlying conditions and healthcare deserts and disparity and COVID and all of these other things that are essentially pointing a finger back at Black women for what is actually not their fault at all, which is it's the conditions in the hospital, it's the overuse of surgery. C-section, is a risk factor for, like you said, hypertension, and for hemorrhage, and for sepsis, and for leading causes of maternal mortality. And we are not discussing that linkage.
Yeah, I try to talk about it all the time, but it's much easier to make Black women the problem. I want to go to some questions here in the chat. Someone's asking about birth plans. I'm going to save my opinion until after you go first. One who came across the idea of birth plans as a way birthing people can try to get some quote unquote control over their birth. What's your opinion on the birth plans, Ali?
I'm pro birth plan for sure. Make a birth plan. Don't let people tell you not to make a birth plan, because that does seem kind of like undermining of you. It's basically a birth plan is you saying, this is what I would like to have happen. And someone telling you not to do that is saying like, no, please don't articulate and state and put into writing your choices and the things that you want to happen. But I've heard all kinds of stories. Like and it's basically in the research too, the sort of lack of support for birth plans. I'll tell two quick stories. One, I was talking about this with somebody actually very recently, and they said, yep, I went into my OB, my like fancy Manhattan OB, and I said, I have this birth plan. And he said, great, great, but like, it doesn't matter what's on your birth plan. We're going to do what we need to do to get that baby out of your body. And she was like, okay, I'm going to go find another provider now. Like, that's not okay. And then the second thing is, during one of my labors, I had 2 births in hospital and 1 at home, planned at home. And the one in the hospital that took the longest, I had made a birth plan. I had already made a birth plan for my first birth. And I kind of cut and pasted for the second birth a little bit, like with some zhuzhing. But I explicitly stated in my birth plan that I did not want to be, I didn't want intervention. I didn't want anybody to come in and break my water. I didn't want, Pitocin. I didn't want certain things. I knew that I didn't want these things. And, I was in the hospital in labor, they had examined me. They had coerced me into an exam, like to a pelvic exam. I'm in the room. I'm 9.5 centimeters. Like I'm ready to push. My kids' birthdays are like a day apart. I'm like, I got to get this kid out so they don't have the same birthday. Like it's on, and, they came in and they said to me, like, we can break your water. Do you want us to break your water? We can break your water. Like, they'd be right out, break your water. And I said, I'm in labor. I'm like, I think I said in my birth plan that I didn't want that. And they said, oh, okay. Went away, came back not much later and asked again, hey, we could, and by the way, it's a holiday, it's a federal holiday. So they don't want to be there to start with. And they asked me again. And then I started doubting myself. Like, do I want them to break my water? Is that what I actually want? Like my doula was so amazing. She was like, let's just give her some time. Like, let's see. But it got in my head and it created this toxic dynamic where it's like, I already told you, like verbally and in my birth plan, that I didn't want this intervention. But here you are offering it to me again and again in a way that makes me doubt what I actually want. So, I mean, that was to me very instructive. But I will always say, like, make that birth plan.
Absolutely. And I think
what do you think? Yeah.
Takeaways was, if you have a provider who doesn't care about your birth plan, then you need to get a different person, right? So our birth plan is only as good as the people willing to honor it, right? And so if your provider doesn't respect birth plans or whatever, and that's important to you, finding that out sooner rather than later is a big issue. I think one of the things that also is important for us to think, and I want to acknowledge the comments of someone who's talking about hoping to conceive and give birth in the near future, really lifting up, like a lot of times we're waiting too late, right? Like, figuring out your birth plan at birth is way too late. Like, these are first visit conversations. And I love that we can, and this is why your book is so important, for us to start thinking about this before it's actually about us, right? And for us to be thinking about this earlier on, because many times in that moment, or even during the pregnancy journey, you may feel like you don't have options, and it's like so much can be happening within that 9 months, which goes by really fast. And so what is the optimal time for thinking about that? And so how do we lift this up to be not just an issue that people care about only during 9 months, but seeing this as a big picture issue that people need to be thinking about earlier on. I think they said that 80% of women become mothers at some point in their life, or close, maybe 60. Don't quote me.
I think it's higher globally.
Okay,
Yeah.
there you go.
But
And
9 out of 10 women.
Yeah. And so I'm always saying, for us to build a real broad-based women's movement, we have to look at all the roles that a woman may play in the course of her life. And that includes, a carer, potentially a mother, and making sure that we have policies and structures in place for all of that. And, I think the danger, and would love your thoughts on this, is that we're in a reproductive rights conversation as narrowly defined as the ability to get pregnant, not get pregnant, or end a pregnancy. Those are all really important issues. But when we don't look at it with a longer spectrum to have the birth that you want, if you do decide to use reproductive organs to raise that child, to be able to afford childcare, like, if we don't add these other pieces in it, we're in a very dangerous and confined conversation about reproductive rights. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. This is my soapbox. I mean, I think, right, there's so much, I, as a newsroom journalist, I covered abortion policy for years. And what's happened since Dobbs is atrocious. And the attention sort of on, like, at the state level, on the rights and the access being curtailed in all of these very obvious and more sinister and hidden ways is so vitally important. But I worry sometimes that we focus on that and exclude these other categories that you're talking about. We say, once a woman or someone has become pregnant, that this is no longer applicable. We're not going to sort of talk about the inherent structural problems and human rights that are actually being taken away from people when they are pregnant, when they are giving birth, after their children are born, in the postpartum period where, insurance and Medicaid stop covering your healthcare. And so suddenly you have no recourse for things that can go really functionally wrong in your body, or in the worst cases, things that are life-threatening. You're sort of without medical coverage in this time. Like, this is to me as big of a problem as lack of access to abortion care. Mm-hmm. And we need to be talking about it as a continuum. But it's also part of this continuum is, I had the privilege of interviewing 3 10-year-old girls in Brooklyn about their sex education experiences, because I wanted to know that I was certain they were getting a better situation than I got, right? I was certain that they were not getting abstinence only sex education like I got growing up in Georgia, and many people get in their states as well. And that's not what was happening there. Not learning about our bodies, how our bodies work, that starts so young, and that is part of this problem too. And we have to address that. We have to learn about how a baby is made in the body when we're very young. We should learn that. Like, I went into getting pregnant thinking that you could get pregnant like anytime, just anytime. It could just happen, because that was sort of the fear-based education that I got. But no, it's actually only a few days a month. And that's important information.
Exactly. Very important information. So I want to come to Anne's question about acknowledgement in the medical community. Like, is there a movement to center mothers? And I wanted to ask that question in, really with the question to you around what is the movement that you think needs to happen for us to kind of regain control over birth?
Well, this book is definitely for people who want to be pregnant or are pregnant, and people who've had birth experiences that were not quite what they thought and need validation around that. But it's also absolutely for providers. It's to celebrate the midwives model of care, which we know is really deeply rooted in evidence and in supporting birth as a physiologic process and centering the person doing it. But it's for obstetricians. It's for folks who they get into this work because they're heroic people and they want to make change. And I think it's important for them to be supported in doing that. I think a lot of folks are really hamstrung by these systems, and they want to provide the kind of care that we're talking about, the kind of care that's supported by evidence and that women and birthing people say that they want and need. But they're within a system where they're part of a team, and the team has metrics to meet, and they have people that they need to move through, and they're just not able to provide that kind of care. So the movement that I would like to see is a movement that involves everyone, where there is enough midwifery care to go around, where that model can be applied anywhere. If every single person in America giving birth, the 4 million people who do each year, wanted midwifery care, they could not have it. There are not enough midwives. So we need to train more people in that. And I do believe, and I want to look into this more from a journalist perspective, but just anecdotally, I'm hearing like more people are going into this profession post-obs. More young people, like you mentioned earlier, are saying like, I want to be part of this. I want to be a midwife. I want to be a direct entry midwife. I want to attend birth at home. I want to get to people in rural places who cannot get to hospitals for hours from hospitals. And I want to provide this kind of care. So I think the movement is, it's person-centered, it's woman-centered, it's you are the expert in your own body giving birth. It's the midwives model, but sort of applied writ large. And it's also changing the financial incentives of birth, because currently in the current system, what is incentivized is more care, more intervention. Very little, if any of it, is based in any evidence. It's all about moving people through a system and profit and fear of legal reprisal.
Right. The liability situation is also very real. And I think that, you know, to the specific point that there is a small movement in the medical community, but even those people, to Ali's point, get suffocated by the bigger system. Many of them give up. Many of them just continue on their personal mission, but there's not enough traction for it to get to a mass movement. And I always wonder, you know, if we can use our consumerist approach to healthcare, which obviously has many, many flaws, but can we use that to our advantage, right? And so one of the things that we always tell folks is like, hey, you know, like, what are you saying to your OBGYN around birth and breast, so they can start to hear it more and more from us, to be like, no, actually, my clients have been asking these questions. They have an expectation about birth plans. They have an expectation that I know about breastfeeding beyond just giving them infant formula sample. They have an expectation that I know how to not have a C-section. That's not what person wants. And so, you know, that consumer-driven piece is really important to me, but it won't happen if we don't have the education. When I've had my 2 C-sections, I didn't know what to say when I was being coerced and I was being told that my baby was going to die if I didn't do this. All these things, and I just didn't have the information. So my goal is that we can move beyond that. So as we wrap up, you know, what should we all know? What's the takeaway that you want everyone to have for this conversation? If you've been enjoying this conversation, please pick up Ali's book. It is a great, important read for anyone. I think when I reviewed it, I said anyone who came from a birth needs to read this book. It is not just about thinking about this issue. I hope that anyone who may have access to colleges, academics, this should be in women's studies departments. We need to make sure that we're talking about these issues long before they are personally applicable, and making sure that we're talking about them as systemic issues and not individual wins and failures. What would you like us all to take away from this, Ali?
I mean, you just said it so beautifully. I feel like we could just leave it with what you said, but to add on a little bit, I would just say that normalizing birth in our culture, normalizing birth storytelling, inviting birth storytelling and showing what is possible. I mean, even, you know, in our media, in our film, in our television, in our literature, I write about this a little bit. I mean, the kind that I grew up with was very, you know, it was like the Hugh Grant movies where it's like a woman is in labor and she's screaming and flying down the hall in a gurney and like she's crazy and like her partner's fainting and the doctor's the only sane person in the room. And, you know, like that was sort of the imagery. And so that gets internalized, right? I mean, Game of Thrones, like one of the most popular shows ever to air on television, like that show is constructed on the bodies of mothers dead from childbirth. I mean, it just is. And that's, that gets in there too. I have a chapter called Fear of Pain, but I have one called Fear of Death. And that's how that's created, is we see images. And even though we may not sort of connect that that's possible, somewhere deep inside of us, we feel that, right? And there are ways in which birth is very connected to death. I mean, they're both these sort of like transcendent, rare moments of unimaginable feeling and connection and transcendence. And I want us to sort of look at birth that way, as a spiritual practice, as a tradition, a sacrament, a moment of empowerment. I mean, imagine if all of us giving birth came away from that experience empowered. I really believe it would just, patriarchy would fall. I think that kind of power, to take that kind of power into your life, would be such an amazing gift. And it would change so many things.
It would. Well, let's hope that, we know that your book will be a powerful contribution to making that happen. And what we hope for our children and our children's children, for their experiences to be very different than the ones that you shared with us and the ones that we're sharing today. Thank you all so much for joining. I'm going to hand it back to Anne, I think, who's going to close us out. But this has been such a powerful conversation, and I feel honored to have been a part of it.
Me too. Thank you, Kimberly.
Thank you both so much for bringing so much wisdom and depth of experience and thoughtfulness and empathy to this conversation. I have taken notes. I have flagged important things. I've rethought my own birth experience and my own birth story from this conversation. I'm inspired to learn more. I can't imagine a better outcome for an hour in the afternoon. And so I thank everybody for having been here today for this conversation. Please buy Ali's book. I put a link in the chat. I actually put a link to Kimberly's book as well, which is really phenomenal. And we are very lucky to hear from both of you today. So I thank you all so much for your time and energy and brilliance. And I wish you all an amazing day.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.